Good morning to everybody. My name is Kathy Moon. I am non-resident senior fellow at the Center for East Asia Policy. My previous incarnation, which ended June 30th this year, was SK Korea Foundation Chair of Korea Studies, the first holder of this position. And for a variety of reasons, I had to return to my teaching position at Wellesley College. I was commuting, actually, from Boston to Washington every week, so it was difficult. But this is a place, an institution with incredible resources, intellectual and camaraderie resources as well, so I'm very, very happy to be back. This is the second annual Young and Brave Next Generation of Korea Experts Conference. And I want to explain to you a little bit about the development of this conference. We actually even have alumni and alumni in the audience, or they'll be joining us throughout the day. I think a good 3 to 5 of them from last year's crew will be joining us. They have formed a very tight-knit community, and I'm sure that this year's participants will be enlarging that community of young folks in their 20s and early 30s who are going to take over many of the jobs that you might have right now, many of the jobs that we hold as people in our 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. Young and Brave, we decided at Brookings to have a conference that focuses on or features people in their 20s and early 30s, not as trainees, not as people who need to come to Washington to learn about Washington, but people who can teach Washington, who can be public educators and public intellectuals with new insights, new research, and new visions appropriate for their generation that will affect policy development and studies regarding the Korean Peninsula in the future for the decades to come. As you know, if you live here in Washington, most of the time it's folks who are older who speak, and the young folks are staffers, they take notes. This time at Brookings, we are the only Next Generation conference sponsors among several Next Generation organizers at various think tanks and universities. We are the only ones who feature young people as the main speakers. What we did also is not choose topics and have others accommodate us, Brookings, but we asked each participant that we had sought out what he or she would like to speak about, what his or her expertise or what his or her own passions in terms of interests regarding the peninsula are. And so we truly catered to the interests, the strengths, and the desired messages of these participants. So it is a unique opportunity to hear them and to learn from them and to engage with them. Why young? Well, when you see them up here, you will see, won't have to explain why we call it Young and Brave. They're really young, okay? Again, in their 20s, and the oldest is maybe early 30s or so. So, the geriatric part of this panel really ends at the early 30s. And it's done on purpose. Brave. Why brave? Because in my view, it takes courage to study the Koreas and in the future to manage issues related to the Koreas. Because the Koreas and the region are filled with such a breadth and complexity of truly life and death issues, potentially. Violence versus peace. Even in the best of circumstances of a reunified Korea under peaceful circumstances, huge dislocations of populations, huge challenge to democracy, which I hope will endure and grow on the peninsula. But there's no guarantee about any of these things, any of the achievements that South Korea has brought to fruition, unless the process of unification, if and when that happens, takes place in a stable, peaceful, cooperative way. And that's wishful thinking as well. So it takes bravery, intellectual courage, bravery of character, and I'll explain why. Bravery of character to examine unpopular views and approaches to the Koreas that are not in vogue or that are considered too idealistic or too unrealistic or too potentially disruptive, and so forth. As you know, Washington, Seoul, so many places in the world that actually work on the Koreas are so polarized by ideological differences. What I find fascinating and hopeful about the younger generation of scholars last year and this year, and by scholars I mean students of Korea in general, is that people have different views, but they are so open to exchanging them, to respecting other people's differences, and not putting up walls between one's views and someone else's views and approaches. And I think this is a vast improvement on the older generations, my generation and older included. We all grew up in the Cold War era with Cold War mentality, where it was black or white, and this generation is post-Cold War. This generation is much more globalized, and they are much more open to various types of information, various types of interpretations in ways that my generation and older were not willing to entertain. Intellectual courage, bravery of character, and also courage to be creative. God knows right now we really need some creative, innovative thinking regarding the Koreas. We can't just continue with the past 20 or so years of a North Korea whom nobody knows really what to do with or how to deal with. And a South Korea who's been progressing so much on the economic front, but lately has been regressing some in the democracy front. And so democracy, economic achievements, we must stay vigilant. And God knows in the United States we need to stay vigilant about democracy. And you all know what I mean. But we're talking about Korea today. I won't get sidetracked because we know that if we all get sidetracked toward the American elections, that we're lost. We'll be here for the whole week. This year's group, as an introductory remark to introduce them, reflects and advances trends among the younger generation of thought leaders on the Koreas. And I would characterize them as this way. The younger generation in their 20s and 30s, they are highly experienced, even though they're very, very young. And they're highly experienced in very substantive ways. I don't mean just reading books. I don't mean just doing social networking participation and throwing their little blurbs out there. They are true thinkers and analysts. They also are very diverse in their professional and issue areas of concern and experience. I have been amazed at the cross-fertilization and cross-ventilation that these young folks last year and this year have been partaking in. They do not belong to one professional silo, which my generation and older, we all had to choose a silo. If you're in academia, you shouldn't be messing around with NGOs or government or think tanks or media. You should just focus on your academic work, and that's how you're going to be promoted and succeed. If you're in government, you have to be wary of NGOs and media, et cetera, et cetera. The younger generations don't think that way. Almost every one of them has experiences in the academic world, starting with studies on the Koreas from their undergraduate life through, many of them, their graduate experiences. Many of them have been contributing as writers to various types of media, both online and offline. We have editors, founders of major Korea-related online resources. Sino NK, Korea Economic Watch, 38 North, various programs from SAIS. I find that really interesting. And also, the same person has also had, in many of the cases, experiences in the NGO world on human rights, on humanitarian issues, on a variety of issues. So media, the private sector, academia, government experience as well, policy worlds, think tanks, research institutes, you name it, and they've already done it at the age of 25, 26, 30, 31. Again, this is a huge difference from the older generation who did not have this kind of cross-fertilization and cross-ventilation as part of their everyday existence dealing with the Koreas. So I think this bodes well for our future. And to tell you how globalized they also are, many of them, if not most of them, have lived in various countries, and I'll name just a few. Korea, South Korea, and I'm talking really living there, South Korea, Germany, China, New Zealand, Australia, where else? Sweden, Belgium. Did I miss any? And the United States and Canada. And those are just some of the countries. The languages that they collectively share to offer you: Korean, German, Chinese, ancient Greek and Russian, Spanish, French, Indonesian, American English, British English, Australian English. Did I miss any? It's an incredible group, and I've been amazed at how fluid they are in their thinking, partly because they have access to different languages and they can access different sources of information. They are not boxed-in people, and I think this bodes well for the future of policy experts, of academic experts, researchers on the Koreas. So with that, we'll start off with our first panel, which is just a conversational roundtable. And I invite the panelists to come up. Thank you. Are we ready? Do we have your mics on?
Yes.
Set, go.
Yes.
No. We had a welcome dinner last night, and we had great fun. So they're also a very fun, loving lot. I'm going to make the introduction short since you have the bios in front of you. And if you don't, they're in the hallway outside. So you can read about all of their accomplishments in, 2 decades or 2 decades and a half or 3 decades of their life so far. I will make very brief introductions. Steve Denny is a PhD student in political science at the University of Toronto. He's also the founder and editor, one of the founders and editors of Sino NK, which is a major website. And we became Twitter friends before we actually met, which is now the way that people seem to meet. So very happy to have Steve here. He lived 21 years in the US, 7 years in South Korea, and 4 years in Canada. So this is already starting out to be an interesting lived experience that we'll benefit from. We have Benjamin Silberstein here. He is a PhD student at the University of Pennsylvania in history, Korean history, Asian history. You are also a co-editor of North Korea Economy Watch.
Yes.
And Steve and Benjamin have done lots of writing. You can find their articles, all sorts of media contributions online. Benjamin is originally from Sweden, 16 years of his life in Sweden, 4 years in Belgium, 2 years in South Korea, 3 years in the United States. You're seeing a trend here that these are not people who are fixed in one location, and so hopefully they're not fixed in their mindsets either. Sharon is from Australia, 25 years in Australia, South Korea 1 year, and 1.5 years in the US. And Sharon is the US coordinator, I want to get it straight, of North Korea Strategy, what's the last?
Center.
U.S.
Center.
Program Officer for North Korea Strategy Center.
Yes, North Korea Strategy Center. I always go by the abbreviations. And she is the person in the United States based in New York City who manages issues related to NKSC, which is headquartered in South Korea. She has a lot of experience in dealing with NGOs, NGO work, and on a variety of issues, not just the Koreas. And we have, last but not least, Poo Hoong Hyun, who is a student at Columbia, and Poo Hoong has a fascinating history. Spent the first 14 years of his life in North Korea, 5 years in China, 3.5 years in South Korea, 2 years in New Zealand, 5 years in the United States. He is the first student of North Korean descent to study at Columbia and at such a fine school. He also was elected, I think it was about a year and a half ago, to be the first ever president of the International Korean Students Association, the first president of North Korean descent to represent everyone else who was from South Korea. Speaks a lot to his leadership, his integrity, and his capabilities that he was honored in that way. Poo Hoong also is very active in various NGOs, in writing, in advising on various matters. And I find that his U.S. experience also is very diverse. He had 3 years in the Republic of Texas and 2 years in the People's Republic of New York City, Manhattan. So with that, we will start off with some questions I had provided them to engage in a good conversation. One of the things that I've noticed about your group, and this panel in particular, is this diversity of residences, language, and international experience. And so I am wondering, in what ways your backgrounds, these backgrounds, have shaped and influenced your thinking. So how has your experience living in multiple countries with different knowledge about the Koreas and different foreign policy interests toward the Koreas, how have they influenced the way you, quote, see both the North and the South? You're welcome to focus on one particular country that you've lived in or multiple. You're welcome to focus on views from the outside on North Korea or South Korea or both. Let's start out with Steve.
Thank you for the kind introduction. My research focuses primarily on identity, so I'm going to answer this question from an identity point of view. Identity is not really what you think you are or who you are. It's what others think you are. You got that? Benjamin and I were talking in the hallway just a moment ago about this. And he said one thing that we learned about spending time in Korea is that Koreans have certain predispositions. Right.
We're giving instructions about
Benjamin and I were talking in the hallway about this very thing, about identity, about what others think you are. And Koreans have certain ideas about who Americans think they are that is quite different from what Americans think they are. And I think this critical reflection upon who I am and upon who we are as Americans is something you can't learn if you don't leave your country, if you do not exit the silo, so to speak. And I think that being in Korea helped me more critically reflect on the idea of being an American and American in identity. And it's something you can't experience unless you leave.
Okay. What about Sharon?
Yeah, I think, Stephen, you touched upon something that we were speaking about this morning as well. You can't sort of get a sense of how you might be perceived when you're in the Koreas unless you get a chance to go there and unless you get a chance to leave your home country. I spent 25 years growing up and living in Australia. I now predominantly work on North Korea-focused issues. And North Korea is not, I guess, one of the sort of priority areas when it comes to policy making in Australia. It felt very much like a foreign and distant issue that the US was tasked with leading to resolve. Having spent some time in South Korea and then coming to the US and seeing sort of the shift in different countries' perception of their burden to resolve the North Korea problem was really interesting. I think it's also really important that you consider how you might be perceived by Koreans in your work and studies towards them. That's something that I think comes with experience being in the country.
And Puhung?
Okay. So I was born in Korea and raised in Korea. So it's my Korea is my country. But what I learned from living in outside of the country is that even though it's my country, it is also a part of international community. That's one thing I realized living in overseas. The decisions we make for our country, both, it could be applied on South Korea and North Korea. Actually, it influences other countries, and especially like nuclear issues and the decisions made by North Korean government. When I was there, I didn't know, or I didn't be aware of how it is actually influences on other countries. Today, I clearly see this each single decision actually creates a lot of tensions and anxiety among nations, especially in East Asia. That's something I learned from living outside of the country, when I see the country from outside of a perspective.
Curious, Puhung, if I could ask you to think about this a little deeper. Even in the United States and, of course, in Korea, you've lived in both the North and the South.
Yes.
What kinds of differences, let's say between Texas and New York, the two republics, did you perceive regarding the Koreas? How do people in Texas, wherever you were, Texas is a big place, obviously.
Right.
How would you compare their views versus New Yorkers' views? And then if you think about having lived in both North Korea and South Korea, some of the similarities or differences in the way that they regard peninsular issues. That's, I mean, we know what we read, but beyond that.
So actually, I prepared that question for the second question. I prepared the answer for the second question, but let me pull it up. Today, I see North Korea has developed a very distinguishable culture by them, their own culture. So even though it is, we were the same country and we shared thousands years of same history, it has turned out very different country. We speak same language, but different dialogue. But it's not the major point. The way people think, the way people see the government, the way people treat themselves is totally different. The difference between New York and the New Yorkers and the Texans is maybe some cultural difference or a little bit of a political, difference. But the difference between North Korea and South Korea is like from east to west. They don't see each other as same country or same. They regard themselves as broad. Same Korean ethnic group, but still North Koreans treat South Koreans as their enemy, and still believe that they needed to liberate their brothers from under the control of United States. We can talk about it, for hours.
You also lived in China, and
Right.
what are your impressions of 5 years in China, having lived there, the Chinese that you were around, or the Korean Chinese that you were around, their views of the North and the South?
Okay, so a lot of Westerners we think China is a communist country, but when I first get to China, when I was 14, to me China was the most capitalized country. There's nothing that everything is possible to me in China if you have money. In a communist country, it is impossible, right? Theoretically, but everything is possible in China. That's what I found out in China. Also, the way Chinese people see. So, Chinese. I spend most of my time with Chinese Koreans, and they are descendants from. They are descendants of Koreans, South Koreans, and North Koreans. But today, they just wanted to come to South Korea and to be a South Korean citizen, because South Korea is more richer than North Korea.
So money talks in China. Ben, you have the sole, I guess, European and Asian experience. And when we say that Benjamin has been in Korea, you've also done trips to the borders via China, I assume, yes. Right? Via China. He has a lot of experience working with Swedish and Nordic experts on the Koreas. And as many of you know, Europeans, and especially the Nordic countries, are way ahead in their knowledge base of North Korea. Specifically because they do have diplomatic relations, and Sweden in particular was the first since the 1970s to maintain diplomatic relations, and Sweden represents the United States for governmental interests vis-a-vis Pyongyang. So based on the reality that you know of the broader and deeper knowledge base in Europe and in the Nordic countries and in Sweden, what are some observations you can make about the way that Swedes, Nordics might view the Koreas versus Americans, South Koreans, et cetera?
Well, if I could start by turning the question around real quick, and just because I think one of the interesting aspects of being Swedish and studying the Koreas to me is that you really have no enemies when you're doing it. You don't have the issue of, well, if you want to meet with North Koreans or travel to North Korea, you have the added problem of, well, I'm from a country that's at war with North Korea. You don't have that issue as a Swedish person. So when you travel to South Korea and you speak to people who work on issues related to the Korean Peninsula, you're regarded as a friend. And the same is true for when you go to North Korea, usually, and when you meet with people from North Korea. So that's a really big advantage. When I've traveled to the border, for example, and I've tried to speak with North Koreans who are in China in a working capacity, who transport goods across the border, for example. One time I even took out my Swedish ID card to really show that, like, look, this is the country I'm from. I promise I'm not American. And I love America personally, but as you all know, there's a little bit of sensitivity with meeting Americans if you're from North Korea. So that's something that I've tried to use to my advantage a lot, definitely.
And the issues, the perspective on issues.
Oh, the perspective on issues also gets very different, I think, in a country like Sweden, where, in a way, yes, you're definitely part of sort of the Western U.S. allied security community, but you're also not in an armed conflict with North Korea, which makes a big difference. I think the range of interests might be a little more diverse, perhaps, in Sweden, where I think in America, for very good reason, a lot of the work and the research on North Korea is done from a security perspective deep down. Like that's, even if you're working on humanitarian issues, a lot of the times the core reason for the interest is security. But in Sweden, you don't really have that presumption that North Korea is a security threat first and foremost. It's also a humanitarian issue, sort of, and that's both of those issues are on the same level, I'd say.
I think that's a very important difference, that there's just a wider agenda for Swedes and Nordics. But what's your sense of diplomacy? Where does diplomacy fit in? In the U.S., in South Korea, diplomacy is really, really difficult, even to talk about having, not formalizing diplomatic relations, but even engaging in diplomatic talks is in and of itself, seems like a near impossibility at times. But in Sweden, in the Nordic countries, in many European countries, the EU, people have diplomatic engagements with North Korea all the time. What kinds of, what have people been learning? What was the role of diplomacy in improving knowledge, improving relations with North Korea?
I think the most important aspect of that is really keeping the channel open. I think that's really the core interest for most Swedes who work on these issues. It's also because, I guess, not as much is at stake for a Swede, or for the Swedes who are engaged in diplomatic communications with both North and South Korea, because of the lack of the sort of security-based sensitivity. But I think the Swedes who have been involved in diplomatic engagement have been able to learn a lot just only by the virtue of continuing to talk. There is a fascinating, I've been waiting for a moment to bring up this one person, and I guess I'll just do it right away. There's a fascinating potato farmer from Sweden named Sven-Erik Johansson. I know how many of you have heard of him. Sven-Erik Johansson. He lived in North Hamgyong province for 8 years, I think, and worked on a potato farm there. And I just think that this man says so much about what you can do when you're a neutral country, neutral small country that doesn't sort of make a big fuss about itself. And I think he left only a few years ago, and I would love to ghostwrite his memoirs for him. I think that'd be phenomenal.
It's also important to keep in mind that a lot of these European countries and others that have diplomatic ties with North Korea have a more consistent sense of an institutional history regarding the North's changes, developments, one step forward, 5 steps back, or multiple steps back, than those of us in the US or South Korea or Japan or elsewhere who can only get little snapshots at a time. And so anytime I've spoken with Europeans, I find that resource, that intellectual resource of a longer sense of history, a longer sense of what's changed, what's not, who are the players, who are not, very, very valuable. Let me move on to another question, and I think Puhung is waiting since he's prepared so hard for this one. This is a conference about generational differences, generational change. In all of you, I want to ask, but in your opinion, what kinds of generational differences have you observed in your country of origin? And Stephen, if you want to talk about South Korea, having been there 7 years, that's okay, even though you're originated from the United States. But in the country that you have lived in a long time, and you can choose, what are the generational differences you have perceived about the way people regard the Koreas? What might older and younger generations teach each other about the Koreas and about the future?
Okay. Okay. Can you hear me? Right. Okay. So my country of origin. So let me go back to North Korea again. The difference first. Let me talk about the difference between my parents' generation and my generation. I would say the biggest difference is the loyalty to the government. My parents' generation was born right after or during the war and educated during 60s, 70s, and they got the full education under under this central distribution system, and that they have memories of the great leader Kim Il Sung, and even Kim Jong Il as well. But my generation, those who were born late 80s and the early 90s, we don't actually, we are very independent from my parents' generation, especially from the government as well. Because when we were growing up, as we all know, the Great Famine took place in middle of the 1990s, and that because of the famine, the government couldn't provide food to the people. So the central, the government runs distribution system was broken. And because of the economic hardship, my generation was forced to go to markets to make money and buy food. So we don't actually remember or we have less memory, or some of the people younger than me, they even don't have the memories of receiving, gifts from the government. I think that's the, so that made us less loyal to the government. Even government, sometimes government could be an obstacle to us, because they regulate and impose a lot of labors on us. And the second thing is, my generation, maybe if I ask the lessons from my parents' generation, would be don't trust the government. My parents' generation, they were loyal to the government. They were the people who made North Korea rich in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But what they gained today is nothing. A lot of people actually died during the starvation. So if I ask my mom or my father, what lesson could you give me about the government, especially North Korea? I'm sure she will say, don't trust the government. I think that's mentality. That's the mentality what my generation in North Korea has today.
This is interesting. Brookings' parents are also now living in South Korea as South Korean citizens, so the whole family's together. So in one sense, they had loyalty, but in a way they felt betrayed by that loyalty because they were disappointed. And your generation and younger don't expect anything from the government. Is that an accurate description?
Yes, we don't expect anything from the government, and we want the government not to ask us to go to field for free labor.
Okay, this is very interesting. Stephen, curious, maybe your perceptions of generational differences in either the US, South Korea, or both?
I think I'll just focus on South Korea. It's interesting that, seeing as how I haven't lived in the US for 10 plus years, I've kind of lost touch in a way. I've lost a sense of my Americanness, perhaps, and that's not such a bad thing, because I've gained a sense of ness in other places. But it's actually a core focus of my work. Yeah. And I want to forward an idea, my reading of some relatively recent data, which highlights, I think, some interesting generational differences and similarities. There is a survey that's run by East Asia Institute, the Asan Institute for Policy Studies, and other organizations in South Korea that seeks to understand how South Koreans see North Korea. And they ask a pretty standard question. Do you see it as a friend, an enemy, a neighbor, or other? And what's interesting is that if you break it down by age cohorts or generations, you see that among those who say enemy, those who share that opinion are the youngest and the oldest. It's about 19-20%. I think it's interesting because clearly they're from different generations. But is it safe to assume that they will thus have different opinions? Perhaps not. And I think perhaps that is something to consider, that just because sort of the conditions of our existence have changed or are different, it doesn't necessarily mean that our opinions will be different. In fact, they're often the same. But in this case, in this specific case of the way in which South Koreans see North Korea, I think it might be because of different generational experiences. The older South Koreans, so 60s, 70s, they experienced great hardship. And many of them associate that with the Korean War, and they fault North Korea for that. Whereas younger people have grown up in times of plenty, in abundance, great material conditions, and they see North Korea as threatening what they have, and thus they perceive it as an other, as an enemy. And in that way, perhaps, there is some similarities between the way in which even young North Koreans see South Korea as an enemy and the way in which young South Koreans are increasingly seeing North Korea as an enemy. I don't know what to make of that. It sounds worrying. It's something to be addressed. But things don't always get better, and sometimes we need to recognize when something isn't and seek to address it.
Excellent. Let's go to Benjamin.
You mean how people in Sweden regard
Generational.
Yeah, generational
differences.
Yeah.
And what each can teach the other based on your experience there.
Well, I think there are differences in the focus of people's interests. We were talking yesterday at dinner about the interest in North Korea versus the interest in South Korea, and Dr. Moon said, which I agree with, that North Korea is winning in a way, the PR war, because people just, not because people have a more favorable image of North Korea, but because the interest is just a lot greater. And that's definitely something that I've seen in both in Sweden, and I really think in the US as well, that when you talk about Korea, and when I tell people that I work on Korea, it's not assumed that would be South Korea necessarily. It's people always ask North or South, which is a perfectly valid question. And my sense is that greater interest is definitely sparked by North Korea rather than South Korea, just because North Korea is perceived as more of a mysterious enigma. So for better or worse. I think if I would think of generational differences in Sweden, I think the older generation was very much colored by, I think among the people who actually care, which sadly are not the entire country, but a lot of those who cared deeply in the older generation were veterans from the Korean War. Sweden was a participant on the UN side in the Korean War, and whenever I write about Korea in Swedish papers, I often get letters, sometimes emails, from people who participated in that effort. And there's also my sense is that adoption used to be a much more central theme for people who were interested in Korea in the older generation. A lot of them were people who adopted children from Korea, whereas now it's more of a general audience that's interested in knowing what's really going on in North Korea. So.
You bring up an interesting point that Nordic countries had adopted large numbers of Korean War orphans, post-Korean War orphans, etc. And so there is this contingent of people of ethnic Korean descent who are Swedish, and it'd be a curious thing to study, what role do they play, if any, in featuring issues related to the Koreas in the Nordic countries. I'd like us to move on to I have two questions remaining that I've been curious about, and you're welcome to pick up any one of them or add to any of the comments that your colleagues at the table here have stated. One question is about how international should we be looking or regarding issues related to the Koreas versus regional or versus alliance-driven. And by that I mean that most policymakers in the US take a regional approach to the tensions on the Korean Peninsula. Most people assume that the US is the major player when it comes to peninsular issues. Japan, South Korea certainly have this view. And China, of course, considers it its own regional issue, different from the US's. And in Europe, I think there is a sense of ceding a certain ground, or ceding a certain kind of respect to the United States as the great power in the region to manage Korea-related issues. But I say this out of genuine concern. In my view, whether we have conflict or we have a stable, formal peace on the Koreas in the future, there are going to be so many issues related to even the best of scenarios in unification, dealing with migrants, dealing with economic need for integration, dealing with political guidance for how to bring 25 million people and 50 million people together. A South Korean society that is no longer ethnically homogeneous versus a North Korean society that has been inculcated in xenophobia. What do we do with all of these issues? And so I'm curious, what are the roles that the international community, that different countries around the world can play? Why shouldn't the stakes be theirs? Why shouldn't it be, you said the stakes aren't as high before for the Nordics versus Koreans, Japanese, Chinese, Americans, but why shouldn't they be higher? What can the international community do? What should it be doing now to think about future scenarios regarding the Koreas? Let's start out with Ben.
So I agree that the stakes should be higher for the international community. I think, just pragmatically speaking, it will be very hard for me to imagine Nordic countries that have, I think Sweden has a combined amount of 5 soldiers permanently stationed on the Korean Peninsula. That really matters, I think. I think concrete connections and concrete interests, whether we like it or not, really do drive these processes. What we can do to change that, I don't know. I think, again, going back to the specific case of Sweden, Sweden likes to call itself a humanitarian superpower, which I think is sometimes a little braggy and not entirely true in all cases. But I think I wouldn't worry too much about countries such as Sweden being there on the humanitarian front with, if need be, one day with the Korean Peninsula. Sweden does do quite a substantial bit of humanitarian work in North Korea, not as much as I think Swedish NGOs would want to do. But yeah, I don't have any clear answer advice, I'm afraid.
But I think it's something we need to keep in mind for the future, that we need to pool resources from all over the world to assist the Koreas if and when. And of course, the scenarios we can leave as question marks. Sharon, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think I'm probably sitting in kind of the same thoughts as Benjamin. A couple of years ago when I was living in South Korea and I was trying to get a sense of what civil society and NGOs in South Korea were doing with regards to the North Korean problem, I had a South Korean friend, an older male, say to me, "Why are you so interested in North Korea? Like, why do you care so much? It's a Korean problem. It's not your problem. You don't have to care about this." And I didn't have a good answer at the time. I thought North Korea's always been, I guess, a fascinating area for me as a student of international relations. And I didn't have a good answer at the time. Having come into working with an NGO that's working in what I consider to be quite an exciting area of North Korean affairs, which is increasing access to information in North Korea, I think that we can look beyond sort of state-based and state-led approaches to resolving the North Korea issue, and we have opportunities now to engage civil society actors all over the world. We work with a lot of European NGOs who are very proactive in supporting initiatives that focus predominantly on affecting and impacting North Koreans in North Korea, the people and not necessarily the government. yeah, I guess I still don't really have a good answer to that question, but yeah.
I asked the question because people don't have good answers, so we need to collect the bits and pieces and try to put them together. Steve, you have any thoughts on that?
I was thinking of Wada Haruki's latest book, his updated book on the Korean War, and it's entitled The Korean War, an International History. And he focuses on the number of international actors who were involved in the conflict. And I think sometimes people tend to forget the international nature of Korean affairs and the responsibility for the international community to ensure that a similar conflict doesn't arise once again. I feel sometimes a bit preachy when I'm asked my opinion about Korean affairs as an American. America has played an enormous role in the region and continues to do so. I think sometimes the best answer might be to not let Koreans deal with it themselves entirely, but to look more resolutely at what Koreans are doing to resolve the problem themselves, because they are doing a lot. I will talk a bit more about during my presentation, so I hope everyone stays for it. But South Koreans, government, civil society actors are aware of the changing demographic makeup of their society. And they've done a reasonably well job at making adjustments to accommodate or to try to accommodate newcomers, from North Korean migrants to wives who are resettling from Southeast Asia with farmers in North Jeolla province. And from what I've learned, they're doing a pretty decent job. So perhaps we could turn the tables a bit and ask, in a world which is increasingly becoming more xenophobic, where discourse has been where the discourse on sort of dislike, discomfort, or mistrust of others in society has been normalized by some individuals, thinking of one in particular. I mean, what can we learn from others who are facing similar transitions? So I would like to maybe turning the tables, challenging the presuppositions, as someone who is both young and brave, to say, what can Korea teach to us? 29,000 North Korean migrants live in South Korea. And there are problems, of course. Social tensions arise, etc. But they're doing pretty well. Why? I wonder if anyone can actually answer that question. Because there are answers, and they're there if you want to find them.
Thank you. So my last question, this is your personal views here. Based on your experience with young people who study and work on the Koreas, what is the most encouraging or positive thing your generation can offer to the future? Poo-hung?
I think you skipped the third question for me.
If you'd like to.
Okay, I prepared, so
Okay.
let me speak a word.
He's truly a good Korean. He does his homework.
So, what are the role of international community, can help play on Korean issues? Is that their role could be bring reconciliation between North and South Korea, So since South Korea and North Korea, we have tension between the two countries for a long time. It's hard to talk to each other. As we see today, there is no, higher official talk between the two countries, or no exchange of information or culture between small organizations, NGOs. So this role could, like international community, like Sweden or New Zealand or Australia, those countries could take this role in favor of Korea, two Koreas. And also, what we can do is to prepare the unification. My friends and I are really willing to devote our lives for our country, both North Korea and South Korea. So I hope to see North Korean defector young professionals in variety of different fields in South Korea and in the United States, like politics, economics, or culture. That's the way that we actually that can be my or defector's contribution to our nation, but at the same time, that we believe that I believe that it will be beneficial to both Koreas and the world as well.
And with international support and participation, I assume you're saying. So why don't you continue and tell us, based on your experience with young people who study and work on the Koreas, what is the most encouraging or positive thing your generation can offer to the future regarding the Koreas?
I was struggling with this question at least over an hour, because I couldn't. It's very good question, but I couldn't get I couldn't get something to tell. But what I've just decided to share is, I think my generation in South Korea and even in North Korea are very open-minded. And that open-minded perspective, we don't know what we could offer for the future, but we actually, that's the open-minded perspective could encourage us to the venture, to start our own venture for the future.
Okay, thank you. Ben?
Yeah. So I think the most encouraging thing with people in our generation who study and work on the Koreas is that people are bothering to learn the language. I really think that matters more than anything. I think there was a time when maybe studying the Koreas was such a new thing that you could write very interesting stuff that hadn't really been written about before, not knowing Korean. But I think we're at a point where that's it's getting harder and harder to do. And I see more and more people who are working in this field who realize that you have to do your at least a couple of years or so of hard work in Korea in order to be able to do what you want to do ultimately. So I think that's the most important thing and something that is very encouraging.
And we do have the Washington representative of the Korea Foundation here, who happens, the Korea Foundation, as many of you know, fund many programs around the world to encourage the learning of Korean language, Korean culture, sponsoring folks to go to Korea to learn about Korean language and culture, etc. And I would add, as an academic here, I find this absolutely necessary. This is the fundamental need to learn Korean in Korean context, but also in diasporic contexts, because Koreans, being Korean or learning about Korean, by being Korean I mean in a global sense, it's not just about living in Korea. There are diasporas all over the world, and in a way different Koreas all over the world. And so that is important, and I think having the language, getting Korean history, Korean culture, Korean literature, political science, social sciences regarding the Koreas, it actually equips scholars and analysts to be very, very deep in their knowledge base and very confident in their policy critiques and ideas. My generation and older all came to the study and policy making of toward the Koreas via China, or Chinese studies, via Japanese studies, via Russian studies, or via international arms control studies, anything but a focus on Korea. And I think that is such a promising thing for the future generations, that this generation and younger, hopefully with more funding from various organizations, will continue to really solidify their language and their historical and their cultural understanding. And then, of course, the challenge is, in the future, we also need to have an open mind to learn about North Korean historiography, North Korean customs and cultures in the different regions, the dialects in North Korea. Many of the defectors who come to the South don't understand South Korean any longer, partly because it's so Americanized, right? So we're going to have to do new kinds of learning about the Korean language and Korean culture in the future as we see the inter-Korea relations unfold. But I think this is an excellent point. Sharon, and then we will have Steve with the last comment on this question.
Sure. So I think that we're lucky that we, I guess, haven't been doing this long enough to be fatigued and cynical, especially when it comes to working with North Korean issues. I work with a lot of young college students who are just so enthusiastic and passionate, and they're not just learning Korean anymore, but they're also aware that they need to pick up another language in the region. So they're learning Chinese, they're doing Japanese, they're doing Russian. It certainly makes me feel a little bit inadequate. And we've really gained from that. We've had, I distinctly remember we had an intern who was proficient in Chinese, and we were doing a research project on meth abuse and trafficking in North Korea. I wanted to look at Chinese sources, but I can't read Chinese or understand it. So with his help, we were able to pull up these really interesting primary sources that referred to China's official response on North Korean drug issues. So that's really exciting. I think, yes, the language cannot be underestimated. I think also there's a hopefulness and a deep compassion that comes with a lot of young people's interest in the Koreas. And I think you really need to bring that into your work, especially when you're working on something as challenging as North Korean human rights issues, which can feel enormous and sometimes insurmountable.
Thanks. I think I want to plug SinoNK, SinoNK.com again. It was mentioned previously, but there's a point here, and it's not just about SinoNK, it's about similar organizations. There's a greater understanding of the value of collaboration today, I think, than there was in previous times or generations. That young scholars are more willing to work with, write with, and travel with people who are not in their department, who are maybe not in their country. I would consider my core group of colleagues to be those who are affiliated in some way with SinoNK to a large extent, including a lot of people up here and some in the audience here today. And they hail from many different countries, different backgrounds, different departments, and they bring different skills to the table, methods, languages, predispositions about how the world operates, and a different approach to understanding our social world. I think that's different, and I'm kind of repeating what I've been told by people who are older than me, so maybe that's what they're recognizing, and I'm internalizing this message. I think they're right, and I think this is a good thing, because I think it's helping us overcome the silo that departments create, or that countries can create. And I think that I would encourage everyone to be committed to that if you're not, or to continue doing it if you are, because it's a bit challenging, but I think with advances in communication technologies, in the ease of travel, it's possible. It's more than possible. It's almost easy if you want to do it. And I think it's really neat, and I've learned so much. And I think my understanding of Korea and the world is so much better because I talk to someone from the Netherlands and someone from Hong Kong. I write with them, I collaborate with them, we share ideas, angsts, etc. And I think that's making us better off. So I think that's something positive about new developments in our generation. that's recognized by the older generation. So let's harness that.
Wonderful. And a great note to end on our opening roundtable. We get so much bad news about the Koreas, and it's nice to hear good news and hopeful news of better days to come. So thank you very much, and we'll move on to the next panel at 12:45. You have about 5 minutes if you need to take a break. Thank you.